Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, here today with another Omnibus review, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the first ever Catwoman Omnibus that there's ever been. This is the recently released Catwoman of East End Omnibus from DC Comics, or as you could call it, as it could have been called I suppose, the Catwoman by Ed Brubaker run, because that's really what's collected in here. It's Brubaker's full run on Catwoman. Of course, there is also a significant contribution in the early stages of the material in here by the late great Darwyn Cooke as well, whose artwork we're seeing here already on the dust jacket and the hardcover. And I really think that the design of this book, the images used for it, all around it, are really cool. So without further ado, let's take a look at that first of all. So already we see, you know, the front cover here. There's a very sort of minimalist design, you could say, with the use of primarily white backgrounds, with these designs of Catwoman, these Darwyn Cooke images featuring on the front and back of each part of it, both the dust jacket and the hardcover itself. But I really like it. The kind of all white spine gives it a really clean look, and it's definitely looking very cool. So the back of the book then just gives you a little blurb, a bit of information about what's going on here, very dramatically stating that Catwoman is dead, or at least that's what she wants you to think. Yeah, very interesting kind of premise with how this whole run starts off. It's a very interesting book and a good read. Obviously I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. Let's just show off the hardcover itself first of all. So we get this Darwyn Cooke image again. The spine is similar to the dust jacket, but it actually uses some different images of Catwoman. Just a quick point of comparison. I'll just show you those next to each other. You know, just some slightly different images, which I thought was cool. You know, just using a lot of different artwork, and that image on the back as well. A really cool image. It's a really good one. I like that one. Yeah, so this run then. This is certainly an interesting book. It's a book that has a very distinct, for the most part, art style. I'll tell you that. If you're not familiar with Darwyn Cooke's art style, it's a very kind of cartoony look, which I don't mean in a bad way by any means, but it gives off a very kind of almost Batman animated series kind of vibe. That's very much what this reminded me of. Of course, Darwyn Cooke is not the only artist who works in here. There is also contributions from other artists listed down here, probably primarily Cameron Stewart, Paul Galassi, Javier Pulido, and some inking as well by Jimmy Palmiotti towards the end. Plenty of others as well, they're all listed on that page. The contents then, you get the full rundown here. So you get a DC Omnibus with a contents page and page numbers throughout, which I feel is worth mentioning because that's not always the case, but I definitely prefer it when you get that so you can track where you are in the book more easily. And it all starts off with the Catwoman Selenas Big Score storyline, which was written and drawn by Darwyn Cooke before moving into the new ongoing series, which then collects the first 37 issues in here, which were all written by Ed Brubaker. So this opening story then is a graphic novel, as I say, from Darwyn Cooke, writer and artist. Really cool art style in here, I like it. It's very, you know, just to repeat myself a bit, very kind of cartoony style. I feel like this will not be for everybody. If you like more of a realistic style, then I can understand why you might not like this. And admittedly, in the past, I haven't been the biggest Darwyn Cooke fan. I know some people will be huge fans, and I totally recognise the significance of some of his work. But I do generally prefer a more, I don't know, quote-unquote realistic style, I guess. But I will say that having finally got around to reading this run, as of picking this omnibus up, because it was a run that I've been meaning to read, but you know how it is, there's always so many things out there to read. You don't always get to everything as quickly as you'd like to, but I have finally read this now, and I will say that not only did I adjust to this art style very quickly, but I got really into it to the point where when the art style changes dramatically about 2/3 of the way into this omnibus, I really wasn't too sure on it, because this was just the way that I was used to this story looking, you know, from the very beginning. So this first story is basically a heist story. You know, it's a classic kind of, you know, in the vein of the Ocean's 11 and all those sorts of films, and every other heist story ever, where a team comes together, a team of criminals. Selena Kyle is, of course, one of them, and they're going to try and pull off a train robbery to get a huge collection of diamonds, I think, that belong to the mob. That's the general gist of what's going on. So Selena puts her team together, and it's pretty cool stuff. Now, in this story, within this graphic novel, and then very early in the ongoing, which carries on directly from here, you know, that ongoing series launches launches out of this graphic novel, so it is all connected. But we get the introduction, or rather reintroduction, I should probably say, of the private investigator Slam Bradley, which is just an amazing tough guy name, isn't it? That's just that's just one of the great kind of pulpy kind of cop names. And he ended up being a much more interesting character than I thought he would be. When I first started reading this, I thought he was going to be, I don't know, maybe a little bit boring, but I was definitely wrong about that. He turns out to be a really cool guy. He's featuring as a secondary character for pretty much all of this run in here. And yeah, he becomes a kind of partner / confidant / romantic interest for Selena throughout. In fact, Brubaker does a great job once this series really gets going of really making all the characters interesting. I'd say this is a very character-driven story overall. Obviously, we've got Selena Kyle / Catwoman front and center, and the problems that she's experiencing, of which there are quite a few in here. It's a very interesting story. There's a lot going on. It's written in that classic kind of crime fiction style that is so heavily associated with Ed Brubaker. I mean, that's really what he does. That's what he excels at. And he definitely brought that to this series. So, you get a lot of the sort of street level crime, a lot of kind of mob activity, corrupt cops and officials, just all the grimy elements of Gotham City really being explored and played around with within the story in here. And the whole East End aspect of it, of course. This is the Catwoman of East End Omnibus, and that's because, it centres in the East End of Gotham. That's pretty much where Catwoman sort of sets up camp in this story. It's where she grew up, or at least where she spent a significant portion of her early life. So she moves back there, and throughout a lot of this book, she's basically trying to turn over a new leaf. So she doesn't want to be a villain anymore. She doesn't want to just look out for herself and just go after one big score after another. She comes back to the East End and tries to do things to make a difference. Tries investing in the area, trying to look out for some of the, less fortunate, vulnerable people who live in the East End. And she teams up with a young kind of protege / friend, Holly. This girl here who features, again, like another secondary character who's in this consistently throughout. And her and Selena and Slam Bradley, love that name every time I say it and read it. All that's some pretty cool character arcs going on here. Every character feels like they have a reason to be involved, in the story. Nobody really feels superfluous or unnecessary. And I'll tell you as well, something that is quite deceptive is that despite the kind of cartoony, seemingly sort of innocent look that a lot of this book has, there are some dark stories in here, man, let me tell you. There's some really kind of gruesome, gritty stuff. I've not really gone into plot details in too much detail so far, but just to give a bit of a spoiler warning now, I suppose I could have given this earlier on, really. But spoiler alert for some of the details in here from this point, just as I talk about some things a bit more specifically. But an early key villain who turns up in this story is Black Mask, and he basically doesn't take kindly to some of the activities that Selena's been doing, because she's pretty much been ripping off mobsters that he's connected to in order to get the funds to do some of the good deeds that she's trying to do. So he goes after her, he goes after people she cares about, and wow, he gruesomely tortures people. It's quite graphic, probably about as graphic as you get away with in a mainstream comic like this. So that certainly for me was a bit surprising. There are also other instances of violence and drug use. Put my tongue back in my mouth. And yeah, it's just quite a mature story. As I say, it's potentially misleading. You could look at this artwork, dismiss it, maybe think, it doesn't look like it's going to be great, or at the very least maybe think that it's going to be maybe quite light-hearted because of that cartoony style. But no, not really. Not for the most part. As I say, things get pretty grim and dark, to say the least, at times in here. But there are some light-hearted moments, some stuff in there for a bit of levity, just so it's not a totally heavy read. You got little instances of little jokes and more fun moments here and there, but for the most part, it is a pretty serious, mature story. Get Darwyn Cooke just did the first 4 issues. By this point, we have artwork by Cameron Stewart. I know he's a bit of a controversial figure these days, let's just say that. Obviously that's not something I'm going to talk about in this book in too much detail. I want to focus on the material, but yeah, he does some art contributions in here. And, you know, in the post-Darwyn Cooke issues, for a long time, the story, the art style really continued in that same vein. You know, you can tell that the style that he set and established early on, you know, they kept with that for some consistency. Until you get to the point about 2/3 of the way in, which I've already touched upon, when Paul Galassi takes over as the main penciler and is inked by Ginny Palmiotti at that point. And then the artwork gets a lot more sort of realistic. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get there. So, yeah, these are some of those Black Mask issues, though. I already mentioned that, but man, yeah, he's got like this torture room, this torture dungeon where he's just taking people in there, and like some of these panels here, honestly, things get a little bit intense. You know, I was kind of reading that thinking, whoa, didn't think they were going to go in quite this much detail with it. Just surprised me a little bit, you know. It's cool in the sense that, you know, Brubaker was bold enough to do it, and they were able to do it. As I say, it creates a sense of, there's real tension during these issues, because this is a great story where someone's going after her and people she cares about and things she cares about, and she doesn't know who it is. She's trying to figure out who it is. It's almost like a race against time, because every minute she wastes trying to figure out what's going on exactly and who's behind it, people are getting hurt. People she cares about are going missing and getting hurt, and you feel the stakes. You know, I was kind of, it was a real page turner by this point, because I was totally invested in the mystery myself. I was like, come on, let's figure out who it is and stop this torturing psychopath, honestly. Yeah, so definitely some really cool moments. Oh, yeah, again, these torture scenes, man. Yeah, a little bit disturbing. Just a fair warning for that, I suppose. If you don't like scenes of torture, I mean, who really likes scenes of torture, you know? But you know what I mean. If it's the sort of thing that kind of you're not comfortable with it particularly, yeah, a bit of a fair warning for that. There is some of that in here. Plenty of other things going on though as well. You know, the Black Mask story does last a while, but then after that, I really like what Brubaker did, because it's a really intense storyline, and I like how when it finishes, things don't just move on to the next story. You know, it's not like, all right, we're done with that now, what's coming next? Which comics often do, you know, but this really focuses on the consequences and of what's just happened to some of these characters. You know, to summarize it, it's basically a case of like intense PTSD for a couple of the characters who really went through some of the more harrowing experiences related to it. So there's a while afterwards where you just see characters trying to sort of figure things out, trying to deal with what they've been through. It's a really cool kind of psychological exploration of the effects of trauma on somebody like that. I think it's well handled. Not saying it's perfectly handled or that it's totally realistic, but I think it's handled sensitively and well enough that, you know, again, I just found myself sympathizing for these characters and rooting for them to kind of get over it, you know, and be able to handle the situation again. And then there's this cool road trip story arc as well, which is a lot of fun, which is where Selena and Holly go on a road trip to a few different cities. They go to Keystone City, Opal City, New York. Meet up with some people, and yeah, that's pretty cool. You know, she's got her reasons for doing that. I won't spoil exactly what the reason for the road trip is, but it's quite a nice story. There ends up being a good reason for it in the end. Batman, not Batwoman, turns up a few times periodically through here, but you know, very much only small appearances for the most part when he does. He's not a main character in here, really, not for the most part. He just turns up for a couple of pages here and there. It's always cool to see a Batman appearance, obviously, and in a story set primarily in Gotham, especially with Catwoman, who has such a long history with Batman. You'd expect him to show up. But it's nice that he doesn't take the spotlight, because obviously this is a Catwoman series. And she definitely does shine. Overall, I was really pleased with just how much Catwoman was, you know, presented as the main character, and was a thoroughly intriguing and interesting character to follow through all these stories. I think she was very well written by Brubaker. and the art style really complemented it for a good chunk of the book. But we're getting to this bit now. This is where Paul Galassi is now the artist, and you should probably see immediately that this is a very drastic change in art style from what he had seen in the first big chunk of the book, that first 700 odd pages or whatever it is, 2/3 of it anyway. And I don't dislike this artwork. I know there's a bit of a reputation for this book. Even prior to reading it, I knew that this part of the book, the artwork for this stuff, was not exactly universally loved. But I got to tell you, I think some of it does look really cool. I did kind of prefer the animated style. I'm calling it animated style. I don't know. It's probably a better technical term to describe it. But that first initial style, anyway, as established by Darwyn Cooke, I think ultimately that really worked well for the series, because you spend so many issues reading it in that visual style. When it then changes to this, it just kind of feels different and everybody looks different. I don't know. It took me out of the story a little bit. I got a little bit less immersed because I was focusing more on the artistic differences at points than the story. But there are some great pieces of artwork in here. It would be unfair to call this bad and just dismiss it totally. But all I would say in the terms of being critical is that sometimes some of the character poses look a little bit stiff. I think the artwork is more dynamic in the earlier issues prior to Galassi taking over as the penciler. But the story during this whole part anyway, it kind of turns into a bit of a turf war for the East End of Gotham after the downfall of Black Mask and other things. The Mafia and other organisations set their sights on wanting to take control of crime in this area, and Selena is getting involved with that, again trying to defend this little part of Gotham that she's calling her own, and standing up for the people there who can't stand up for themselves. And that's really the common theme throughout this whole book, and it was good to see Catwoman in this more generally heroic role. Traditionally she's always skated that line between villain and hero, anti-hero at best usually, and I guess she is kind of an anti-hero in here because she's still doing a lot of morally questionable things. Yeah, certainly her motivations always seemed good, and you could get behind her as a character, so no issues in that regard. There's this whole kind of ongoing story as well with this kind of ancient Egyptian cult as well. They kind of show up, start causing problems. Selena's drawn into that whole thing. But ultimately, yeah, overall, a really good read. I think the writing is consistently great throughout, even if the artwork maybe isn't entirely, just because this final section. But you know what? You may love this. Maybe you hate it, but maybe you weren't put off by it at all. And fair play, Let me know what y'all think, though. Happy to hear opinions on this. Did you prefer the art style before this Galassi section? Maybe you preferred this to the previous stuff? Or maybe you just didn't like any of it? Let me know. I don't know. I'm happy to hear any thoughts on the material. But I do recommend this book if you are interested in reading some Catwoman solo stories. I think this is probably the best place to start. I remember prior to the announcement of this book and there being no Catwoman omnibuses, I was wondering if it might actually be the New 52 Catwoman run that got an omnibus before this, but I think this was the stronger material to start off with. The binding of the book, let's just mention that a little bit as I'm struggling a little bit with it here. It is a tight bit of binding on this book. As you get to the front and you're at the back, it is going to want to close itself on you like that. No two ways about it, can't get away from it. This is quite stretched out as well. I've taken my time to make that a little bit looser, but even so, you're going to have to hold it open, I think, when you're in the first and last sort of 200 pages or so of the book. Can't really be helped, but not a huge deal. Worth mentioning though, I think, because, you kind of just have to expect it with a book of this size and the way that DC tend to put these things together. In terms of extras in the back, you get a few little character profiles, and there are some cool variant covers as well, actually, by different artists. So I think there's one by Adam Hughes. Yeah, there's an Adam Hughes one. Kevin Nolan. There's a Jim Steranko one, actually. Yeah, that one there. Probably the coolest looking one. Steranko, just one of the coolest guys who's ever worked in comics, in my opinion. But yeah, so that's the Catwoman of East End omnibus. Catwoman's first ever omnibus from DC. yeah, interesting to see where they go next in terms of Catwoman Omnis. I would quite like personally to see the 90s Catwoman series, you know, the Jim Ballant one. That's a classic one. But yeah, we shall see. Let me know though. Thoughts on this run, thoughts on the Ed Brubaker Catwoman series, and thoughts on which omnibus you think should come next in terms of collecting Catwoman. I'm always happy to hear what people's thoughts are on these sorts of things. But thanks as always for watching. If you've stuck with me through this, appreciate it as always. And I'll be back again soon to discuss something else.